under the vast and restless sky of the frontier, where the wind carried both the scent of dust and the whispers of forgotten prayers, a woman stood alone at the threshold of her cabin. Her hands, though roughened by years of toil, trembled ever so slightly as she pressed them to the weathered wood of the doorframe, as if seeking comfort from something that had no warmth to give. She had carved out her existence here at the edge of wilderness, where silence was both companion and tormentor, and every sunrise was a reminder of survival rather than promise. Yet within her heart, a fragile ember of yearning remained, flickering against the cold winds of grief. Her name was Sarah, a widow of 28 years, bound not by the threads of society, but by the ache of solitude. 3 winters had passed since the day she lost her husband. 3 winters where the snow had buried not only the earth, but also her laughter. She had known love once, fierce and untamed, the kind of love that builds dreams upon barren soil. Now she knew only the echo of it, a hollow sound carried across the prairie. And still she endured, for endurance had become her second nature, as necessary as breath. The land stretched endlessly around her, an ocean of tall grass, rippling like waves beneath the hand of the wind. To others it was barren, a harsh and unforgiving place. But to Sarah it was a mirror. Its vast emptiness reflected the loneliness that had taken root within her soul. Each day was carved from routine, the tending of her small patch of earth, the steady scrape of the hoe against stubborn ground, the cautious eye cast toward the horizon. Each night was filled with memories, ghosts whispering through the rafters of her cabin as she tried to rest upon her narrow bed. Yet in the heart of this solitude, something stirred, like the first green shoot pushing through frost. It was not joy, not yet, but the faintest pulse of possibility. She did not know it, but her life was on the edge of change. Change as sudden and startling as a storm breaking across the still plains. Fate was already walking toward her, quiet as a shadow, ready to tangle her story with another. Her days were not without beauty, though she rarely allowed herself to see it. The sunrises painted the horizon in strokes of rose and gold, spilling healing light across the world. The nights were jeweled with stars, each one a silent witness to the resilience of her spirit. Even the wind that keened through the cracks of her cabin carried a strange comfort, as though reminding her she was still alive, still capable of feeling. There were moments when she would close her eyes and let the breeze caress her face, imagining it was the hand of her husband once more, brushing away the strands of hair that fell loose from her bun. In those moments, her sorrow softened, and she could breathe again. But beneath the beauty, the frontier was not gentle. It tested every living soul, stripping away weakness and leaving only what could survive. Wolves prowled the ridges, their howls rolling across the night like a chorus of hunger. Coyotes circled at the edges of her land, bold and restless. Even the silence held danger, for it left her alone with her thoughts, and those thoughts were often sharp enough to cut. Yet Sarah had become steel in the fire of loss, tempered by hardship, polished by tears. Her story might have remained forever one of quiet endurance, if not for the sound that broke her world open. A cry, not of coyote or hawk, but of a child, thin, desperate, trembling with terror. The moment she heard it, something deep within her awakened, something buried but never fully gone. Her body froze, her breath caught, and then her heart began to pound with a rhythm she had not felt in years. the rhythm of fierce, protective love. That cry would become the thread that wove her fate to another's, binding two broken souls across the chasm of fear and mistrust. It would draw her out of her grief and into a story greater than herself, a story of healing, compassion, and the kind of love that transcends boundaries. And so, as the day bled into twilight and the shadows stretched long across the land, Sarah found herself standing at the edge of everything she thought she knew. The air was heavy with heat, the sky an unbroken expanse of copper and fire, and in the distance the cry rose again, fragile, piercing, unbearably human. She placed a hand over her chest, as if to steady the storm within her, and took the first step toward destiny. If the heart has the courage to answer, miracles unfold in the unlikeliest of places. This tale is not merely of wolves and wilderness, but of love reborn where grief had made its home, of hope rising where despair had settled like dust. It is a story for every soul who has ever longed for healing, who has ever believed that compassion can change the course of a life. And as you journey with Sarah, let her courage and tenderness remind you of the quiet power within your own heart. If her story brings warmth to you, if it stirs even a spark of light in your spirit, then let that connection be our bond. Share your thoughts, let your voice be heard in the silence, and walk beside us by leaving your comment. If this beginning whispers to something inside you, let your support, your like, your subscription be the gentle gift that helps more stories like this one find their way into the world. For together, in the simple act of listening and sharing, we keep alive the timeless truth that love in all its forms has the power to heal. And with that single step into the gathering dusk, Sarah's path led not only into danger, but into a future where her broken heart might one day learn to beat again. The sound rose again, trembling against the wide expanse of sky, and Sarah's pulse surged like a drum within her chest. It had been so long since her heart had raced for anything other than fear. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the storm gather inside her, and moved quickly across the brittle ground, boots kicking up little clouds of dust that hung in the air like smoke. The horizon shimmered with heat, and the land itself seemed to quiver, as though it, too, was holding its breath. Her hand brushed the cold iron of the Colt at her hip. She had lived long enough at the edge of Apache territory to know that nothing was ever as it seemed. A child's cry could be bait, a trap meant to draw the unwary. Yet this sound was too raw, too pierced with terror. It carried the unmistakable timbre of innocence. And innocence was a fragile thing she could not ignore. Each step toward the sound was a step against her own caution, against the voice of survival that whispered she should turn back. But another voice spoke louder, an aching maternal echo she had long thought silenced, the memory of the child she had once held and buried too soon. That phantom weight guided her steps now. The rocky outcrop loomed ahead, jagged against the sky, like the broken ribs of the earth itself. From within its shadows came the growls, deep and hungry, mingled with the small, cracking sobs of a child too terrified to scream any longer. Sarah's breath caught, and she moved swiftly, climbing the rise until she could see below. There he was, a boy, no more than 6 years old, pressed back into a cleft of stone. His small chest heaved with shallow breaths, his dark eyes wide, glistening with tears that carved streaks through the dust on his cheeks. His bare skin was marked with scratches, his hair tangled, a single feather trembling in the strands. He clutched a tiny wooden knife in his hand, more toy than weapon, more prayer than defense. Encircling him were 4 wolves, their lean flanks taut with hunger, lips curled, fangs bared in pale crescents of menace. The boy's trembling form was the center of their slow, deliberate circle. For a long moment Sarah froze, her own fear rooting her to the ground. This was the son of her enemy, the people whose arrows and rifles had stolen her husband from her. The irony was bitter, ash upon her tongue. She could turn away. It would be easy. Step back, retreat into her lonely cabin, let the wilderness claim what it had cornered. No one would know. No one would judge. But as the boy's eyes lifted and found hers across the distance, everything inside her broke. She did not see an Apache child. She did not see the blood of the man who had destroyed her life. She saw a child as small and fragile as the daughter she had once cradled, as fleeting as the breath that had left her stillborn. In his gaze she saw the reflection of her own loss, her own yearning, her own desperate need to protect. And the law of the land, cruel, merciless, crumbled before the greater law of her heart. Her voice tore from her throat in a raw, primal cry that startled even her. The wolves turned, their yellow eyes gleaming in the sunlight, hackles rising as they fixed their attention upon this new challenger. The alpha stepped forward, scarred muzzle wrinkled in a snarl, growl reverberating low and deep. Sarah did not falter. The Colt was in her hand before she had thought it through, her finger pulling the hammer back with a sharp metallic click. The gunshot cracked across the plains, a violent echo that scattered birds from the nearby grass and rolled like thunder off the distant hills. The bullet struck the alpha's shoulder, spinning it back with a yelp. Dust rose, sharp and stinging, as she fired again into the earth, sending shards of stone spraying into snarling muzzles. The pack faltered, courage broken, hunger outweighed by survival. In moments they melted back into the wilderness, shadows once more among the rocks and grasses. Silence fell heavy. The air reeked of gunpowder, sharp and bitter. The boy's sobs echoed in that silence, soft and jagged, pulling at her in a way no sound had in years. She lowered the Colt slowly, breath coming hard, and stepped forward. The child pressed himself further into the stone, body rigid, eyes fierce with fear. He did not trust her, and why should he? To him she was the monster, the invader, the one his people had taught him to dread. His leg was bleeding where one wolf had caught him, crimson soaking into the dust. He trembled not only with pain, but with the weight of everything he had already endured in his too short life. Sarah knelt, careful, her hands open in surrender. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice cracked from disuse, yet tender, carrying healing warmth like a balm in the dry air. The boy did not move. His silence was a wall she could not cross, but she could see the wound worsening, blood soaking into the rock beneath him, life leaking away with each heartbeat. She knew leaving him here meant death, if not from wolves, then from fever, heat, or loneliness. So she did what instinct, not logic, demanded. She rose slowly, turned her back to him, and began to walk toward her cabin. She did not call, did not coax. She simply trusted that in her retreat he would find the courage to follow. Behind her she heard only silence at first, heavy and suffocating. Then a shuffle of stone, a hiss of pain, the sound of small feet limping, always at a distance, but there. He was coming. The sun dipped lower as they moved across the plains, a strange procession of two souls bound by desperation. Sarah's heart beat not only with fear, but with a new, fragile hope. She had made her choice, and there was no undoing it. She would protect this child, even if it meant risking everything. By the time they reached the cabin, the light was softening into evening. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the familiar scent of wood smoke and old timber rushing out to meet them. Inside, shadows stretched across the small room, the hearth waiting to be lit, the table and bed standing solemn in their usual places. The boy paused at the threshold, eyes darting, uncertain, as though stepping into another world. Sarah busied herself with deliberate calm, heating water, tearing linen for bandages, setting out the small jar of salve and the half-empty bottle of whiskey Jedediah had left her. She did not demand, did not plead. She simply prepared, hoping that necessity would draw him closer. And slowly, with hesitant steps, it did. When he finally sat upon the edge of the chair, his body taut with readiness to flee, Sarah knelt before him. His skin glowed like polished copper in the dim light, his eyes dark and ancient, far older than his years. She touched the wound with gentle hands, her voice a murmur of reassurance, as though speaking to her own lost child. He flinched, but did not run. She cleaned the blood, stitched the torn flesh, pressed salve upon it, and wrapped it in linen. Through every sting and pull, he sat in silence, jaw set, courage burning quiet and steady. She saw in him not an enemy, but a soul forged by hardship, a reflection of herself. And as she tied the final knot, she whispered his name, not the one she knew, for he had not spoken it, but the one she gave him in that moment. "Nodin," she said softly. "Wind," for he was wild, untamable, carrying both sorrow and strength. That night, as firelight flickered across the walls and shadows danced, she laid a blanket near the hearth for him. She stretched out upon her cot, Winchester within reach, but her heart restless, caught between fear and something tender she could not yet name. The silence that filled the room was no longer the silence of grief alone. It was a shared silence, fragile, healing, a bridge beginning to form. And when the child's fevered whimpers broke the stillness in the depth of night, Sarah rose without thought, cradling his damp forehead with a cloth, whispering words not of language, but of love. In that moment, grief loosened its grip upon her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt not only sorrow, but also the quiet promise of healing. The dawn would bring new challenges, questions, dangers, the watchful eyes of the world beyond her cabin. But for now, in the fragile cocoon of that night, a bond had been born. One that would carry them both into a future neither could yet imagine. The fever came like a thief in the night, slipping into the boy's fragile body with a cruel determination. By dawn, his skin burned beneath Sarah's hand, heat rising from him in waves that made her heart ache with helplessness. She had feared this, had seen fever claim strong men on the frontier with merciless speed, and now it threatened the small life entrusted to her care. His breaths came quick and shallow, his brow damp with sweat, and his lips moved with whispered fragments of a language she could not understand. But she knew what pain sounded like, what fear in sleep looked like, and it tore her open in ways she thought herself long closed to. She moved tirelessly, fetching water from the basin, wringing cloths to lay across his brow, lifting his head just enough to press sips of willow bark tea between his lips. He resisted at first, his eyes wild even in delirium, but she held steady, her voice low and soothing, murmuring sounds that carried no meaning but all the tenderness she could summon. It was the same sound she had once made for her infant daughter, a gentle hum of comfort that spoke across the silence of grief. Every time she touched him, every time she eased the trembling of his small hands, she felt the sharp edges of her own sorrow soften. When he struggled against her, fists weak but determined, she gathered him into her arms, holding him firmly yet gently, whispering, "Peace, little one, peace." Her words were like healing balm poured upon a wound, and slowly his body would sag, surrendering to her strength. She realized then that this boy was no stranger to pain. His silence was not only fear, but defiance, a shield against a world that had demanded too much of him already. Yet when fever stripped him bare, when his voice cracked in broken dreams, she heard his heart speak, and she answered it not with questions, but with care. The nights were the hardest. Darkness pressed against the cabin like a heavy hand, and the wolves howled in the distance, as if mocking the fragile sanctuary she had built. But inside, the glow of the hearth painted their faces in gentle firelight. Sarah would sit beside the boy for hours, refusing her own rest, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the occasional soft cry torn from his fevered lips. She spoke to him then, her words spilling into the silence as though confessing to the night itself. She told him of her home in Ohio, where the hills rolled green and endless, where roses bloomed in her mother's garden, fragrant and soft. She told him of her father, who had been a doctor, and the way he had believed that every life was worth saving, no matter how poor, no matter how lost. She spoke of her husband, not of the way he had died, but of the way he had lived, his laughter that rolled like thunder, his hands steady and kind, the way he had made her feel seen in a world that too often looked past women. She even spoke of the child she had lost, her voice breaking as she admitted for the first time how it had shattered her to bury her baby beneath the cold earth. The boy lay silent, his dark eyes half-lidded, yet she felt as though he listened. His presence became something more than burden, more than danger. He was the keeper of her secrets now, even if he did not understand her words. And in that sharing, something within her eased, like a knot slowly untying. The cabin no longer felt haunted by ghosts, but alive with witness. On the third day, when she awoke with her head slumped against the chair and the soft glow of dawn seeping through the shutters, she found him watching her. His eyes were clear for the first time, the fever broken, and though his face was still pale with exhaustion, he was present, anchored once more to the world. Relief washed through her like rain across parched earth. She touched his brow and felt only warmth, not fire, and tears gathered in her eyes before she could stop them. He did not speak, not yet. But when she placed a bowl of broth before him, he lifted the spoon with trembling hands and ate, slow and deliberate. The sound of the spoon scraping against the bowl was the sweetest music she had heard in years, steady and alive. She found herself smiling at him, a smile that reached the hidden corners of her heart. Their silence shifted then. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but the silence of cautious companionship. He followed her with his gaze as she moved about the cabin, as though studying her every motion, measuring the truth of her. And she, in turn, found herself attuned to him. The way his eyes darkened when he remembered fear, the way his small hands traced the grain of the wooden table as if anchoring himself to something solid. But healing was not without shadows. That afternoon, the distant thunder of hooves broke the fragile peace. Sarah's stomach tightened as she peered through the shutters, heart hammering against her ribs. 4 riders approached, their uniforms blue against the dusty plain, rifles slung with casual menace. The cavalry. She whispered to the boy, urgent and low, and he understood enough to crawl beneath the bed, pulling the quilt down with small, trembling hands. She schooled her face into calm, smoothing her hair, and stepped to the door just as Sergeant Corrigan dismounted. He was a man she despised, his authority worn like armor, his small eyes sharp with suspicion and something darker. His voice oiled its way across the threshold as he claimed they were searching for a runaway Apache boy, 6 years old, dangerous by virtue of blood alone. Sarah felt her breath still, but her voice remained steady as she lied, telling him she had seen nothing but dust and rabbits. He stepped closer, gaze sliding past her into the dim interior, words laced with threat and vile insinuation. He spoke of bounties, of $50 for a boy's life, and hinted at what he thought a lonely widow might trade for survival. Rage flared in Sarah, sharp and cold. She met his stare with a steel he had not expected, telling him with icy calm that she could secure her own home, that she knew how to use her rifle well. For a moment, silence burned between them, and then, as bullies often do, he withdrew with a sneer, leaving behind the promise of trouble yet to come. When the dust of their departure settled, she leaned against the door, trembling, until she heard the soft rustle of the quilt. The boy crawled out, eyes wide not only with fear, but with dawning comprehension. He had heard enough to understand. He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time since she had found him, his lips parted. A single word slipped out, soft as breath, yet heavy as destiny. Taza. He pressed his small hand to his chest, his eyes never leaving hers. And in that one word, that gift of trust, Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. He was no longer just a nameless child she had pulled from the jaws of wolves. He was Taza, and she was no longer just a grieving widow in a lonely cabin. She was his protector, his shelter, his chosen guardian against a world too cruel for innocence. That night, as firelight flickered and shadows danced once more, Sarah whispered his name into the silence, savoring its shape upon her lips. Taza. The bond between them was no longer fragile. It was forged, sealed by trust, and it would carry them both into trials yet unseen. The healing had only just begun. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm, tender and strange, as though the world itself was holding its breath to see what might become of them. Taza, once only a silent shadow trembling on the edges of her presence, began to drift closer, drawn as if by an invisible thread that neither of them fully understood. Sarah moved through her chores with a steadiness carved from years of loneliness. Yet now every motion was witnessed, every small act reflected back at her through the dark, curious eyes of the boy. He watched her mend fences, knead dough, stack kindling, and polish the old Winchester, his gaze sharp and unblinking, as though he was storing each detail deep within himself. At first, he did not speak. His silence still clung to him like a protective cloak, but the wall between them was no longer built of fear. It had softened into something more like hesitation, the pause of someone weighing whether to trust the light after too much darkness. And then, slowly, the wall cracked. One afternoon, as Sarah set a loaf of bread to rise, he pointed to the rifle leaning against the wall and spoke a single word, low and sure. Go. The Apache word for gun. Sarah froze, startled by the sound of his voice, and then she answered softly, Rifle. She tapped the weapon gently. Rifle. His eyes flickered with interest, and he nodded once, as though recording the sound. Then he pointed to the skillet warming on the stove. Ta, he murmured. Sarah's lips curved into the first unguarded smile she had worn in years. Plate, she told him, the English word gentle on her tongue. And so it began, a fragile bridge of words cast across the chasm of their difference. The game grew day by day. Taza would point to an object and whisper its name in his tongue, and Sarah would answer with her own. She repeated his words until her accent softened, and he repeated hers until the syllables bent toward familiarity. Their voices, once strangers in the cabin, began to weave together like threads in the same cloth. The silence that had once pressed down on Sarah's heart was now filled with sound, soft, halting words that carried healing with every exchange. She learned more than language from him. Taza showed her the wild with the quiet pride of one born to it. He crouched in the dirt outside the cabin, his small fingers tracing the fresh prints of a jackrabbit, explaining with simple gestures how long ago it had passed, whether it had been running or feeding. He plucked berries from a low shrub and shook his head when she reached to taste them, pointing to another bush heavy with safer fruit. He knew the roots that healed, the leaves that soothed fever, the songs of birds that signaled rain. To her, who had once felt herself hardened and wise in solitude, his knowledge was a revelation. In his presence, she was reminded that the land, so often cruel, could also be generous if you knew how to listen. And she, in turn, offered him the world of her own making. She showed him how to shape bread from flour, water, and patience, his small hands pressing awkwardly into the dough beside hers. She let him stir the pot of stew simmering on the stove, laughing softly as he wrinkled his nose at the steam. She stitched a small pouch from scraps of cloth and gave it to him to carry the smooth stones and feathers he collected on their walks. Bit by bit, the cabin that had been a tomb of grief transformed into a home alive with presence, with the humble joys of daily life shared. At night, by the glow of the fire, Taza sometimes leaned against her chair, his head heavy with drowsiness, and Sarah would hum the lullabies her mother had once sung. The songs had lain buried in her memory, too painful to touch after the loss of her child, but now they rose unbidden, their melodies soft as a healing balm. She sang not only for him, but for herself, and in the music she found release, the ache within her chest easing with each note. She would glance down at him, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and even, and feel the warmth of belonging bloom again inside her. Yet beneath this fragile peace ran the current of danger, always humming. Sarah knew the cavalry had not given up their search, and the bounty on the boy's head hung over them like a shadow. She barred the cabin door each night, set the Winchester within arm's reach, and scanned the horizon each morning, her heart lurching at every distant rider, every cloud of dust. But fear no longer held her captive. Where once it would have paralyzed her, now it sharpened her resolve. She would protect him, no matter what it cost her. Her conviction deepened one evening when Jedediah Stone arrived, his mule laden with pelts, his weathered face softened by the sight of her. Sarah had long trusted the old trapper, his silence a comfort, his stories a reminder that she was not entirely forgotten by the world. But when he stepped inside and saw Taza, his pale eyes sharpened with recognition. He spoke the boy's name softly, and then, with a weight that chilled her, told her the truth. Taza was the son of Cochise, the great Apache chief, the man whose name had once been a curse on the lips of settlers. The words struck Sarah like a blow. She stared at the boy, sleeping peacefully on his blanket, and felt the cruel twist of fate coil inside her. The child she had grown to care for, to cherish, was not merely a lost boy. He was a symbol, a prince of his people, the son of the very man she had long blamed for her own shattering grief. For a moment her breath faltered, and her hand trembled as she touched the back of the chair. The irony was vicious, almost unbearable. But as she looked down at Taza, saw the delicate curve of his cheek in the firelight, heard the soft sound of his steady breathing, she knew the truth that lay deeper than bloodlines or vengeance. He was still the boy she had carried from the wolves, still the boy who had whispered his name to her with trust, still the boy who had softened the silence of her heart. Jedediah's warning weighed heavy, that soldiers would pay, that enemies within his tribe might use him, that danger was everywhere. Yet alongside the fear came something else, a deeper certainty, like a thread of healing woven through the fabric of despair. She could not undo what she had begun. She would not abandon him. In his survival, she found her own. That night, long after Jedediah had gone, Sarah lay awake listening to the quiet breaths of the boy who slept by the fire. The weight of what she carried pressed hard upon her, yet within her stirred a profound and tender strength. Her grief was no longer a chain dragging her into darkness. It had become soil, fertile and ready, and in it a new bond had taken root, fragile but alive. As the embers glowed faintly, she closed her eyes and whispered the name that had changed everything, Taza, and felt for the first time that hope was no longer a stranger in her home. And when the night deepened and the wind swept softly across the plains, Sarah sensed that their story was only beginning, that the horizon held trials yet untold, but also the healing promise of love born in the unlikeliest of places. The nights grew softer after the revelation, though the weight of danger never left them. Sarah's cabin, once only a lonely shelter against the wilderness, now held a fragile life at its heart, and she felt the air itself thrum with both risk and meaning. Every flicker of the firelight across Taza's face reminded her of the truth Jedediah had laid bare. This was no ordinary child. He was the son of Cochise, the very chief whose name had long stirred both awe and terror. Yet for Sarah, titles dissolved when she looked upon him. He was still the boy she had lifted from the jaws of wolves, still the boy who whispered trust with his touch, still the boy who softened the silence of her grief. Each day was a mixture of routine and revelation. Taza grew stronger as the wound on his leg healed beneath her careful hands. He walked with less of a limp, his steps lighter, though he still favored one side when the weather turned cool. He worked beside her in the garden, pressing small fingers into the soil, his face serious as she guided his hands. He followed her into the woods when she went to gather firewood, pointing out deer trails, teaching her which branches would burn long into the night and which would smoke bitterly. She showed him how to mend torn fabric, his small brow furrowed in concentration as he pushed the needle awkwardly through. Together, they stitched not only cloth, but the delicate seams of a shared life. Their language lessons deepened. He began to smile when she stumbled over Apache words, his laughter soft and unpracticed, as though laughter itself had been a stranger to him for too long. When she repeated them correctly, he nodded with solemn approval, as if she had passed a test of belonging. In turn, he repeated her English words with careful precision, his voice low but steady, weaving his world with hers. Their conversations were still sparse, but each word carried weight, a stone placed upon a bridge that grew stronger with every day. At night, when shadows stretched long and silence settled heavy, Sarah sometimes found him sitting near the hearth, his gaze fixed on the flames, eyes ancient with thoughts too heavy for a child. In those moments she would sit beside him, offering her quiet presence as balm. She spoke softly of her memories, of her home far away, of the roses her mother once tended, and the rivers that shimmered in the Ohio sunlight. He listened with an intensity that humbled her, as though each word was nourishment. And in return, though sparingly, he began to share fragments of his own world. He told her names of stars in his language, pointed to constellations with a reverence that made the night sky itself feel sacred. Sarah began to feel the land differently through him. The wind no longer seemed only mournful. It carried whispers of guidance. The tall grasses, once only a symbol of isolation, now looked alive with stories. She saw in them the truths he carried, connection to earth, to ancestors, to the living rhythm of wilderness, and with each lesson, each shared glance, the jagged edges of her grief softened. Healing crept quietly into her bones, not sudden, but steady, like dawn pressing against the horizon. But peace was not without shadows. She could never forget the words of Sergeant Corrigan, nor the malice that had glinted in his eyes. She knew he would not rest, that greed would drive him back to her door. Her heart tightened each time she glimpsed dust on the horizon, each time a distant rider appeared. She slept lightly, the Winchester close, her body attuned to every sound of the night. Still, fear no longer hollowed her out. Instead, it made her resolve firm. She would not let Taza be taken. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky with strokes of gold and violet, Sarah saw a dust cloud rising in the distance. Her heart clenched. She ushered Taza inside, her voice calm though her pulse raced. They barred the door, and she pressed him into the shadows as the sound of hooves drew near. Soon, Sergeant Corrigan's voice rang out again, dripping with authority and menace. He dismounted, swagger heavy with entitlement, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the cabin. Sarah met him at the threshold, her spine straight, her voice cool. Corrigan pushed, his words twisting like knives, hinting again at the bounty, at suspicion, at the danger of a woman harboring an Apache child. He sought to break her will, to frighten her into surrender, but she stood firm, steel forged by fire and grief. When he reached to step inside, she lifted the Winchester with calm precision, her voice like ice as she reminded him that she was not defenseless. For a tense moment, the world hung still, danger thick in the air. Then Corrigan, seeing the unwavering fire in her eyes, withdrew, though not without promise of his return. His sneer lingered in the air long after the dust of his departure settled. Inside, Taza emerged from hiding, his eyes wide, filled not only with fear, but with comprehension. He had heard enough, had seen enough, to understand. He stepped toward her with a courage that pierced her heart, and for the first time he reached out, laying his small hand upon her arm. His voice was soft, a whisper of trust that filled the cabin like thunder. "Taza," he said, and touched his chest. It was his gift, his name, offered freely. Sarah felt tears sting her eyes as she knelt to meet him, whispering his name back to him, letting it linger on her tongue as though it were a prayer. In that moment, everything shifted. He was no longer just a child she had saved. He was Taza, the boy who had chosen to trust her, the boy whose life had become bound to hers. She gathered him into her arms, and for the first time since her husband's death, since the burial of her stillborn child, she allowed herself to feel the fullness of love untainted by fear. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Sarah felt the cabin transform. The walls no longer closed in with silence. They glowed with warmth, with healing presence, with the promise of something new. Outside, the wind carried the cry of coyotes, the endless song of the wilderness. But inside, there was peace. Fragile, precious, but real. And as she lay down, listening to the soft, steady breathing of the boy who now bore a name upon her lips, Sarah knew that life had turned. She could not see the horizon of what lay ahead, but she felt within her a courage she had thought forever lost. The world beyond her cabin still waited, filled with danger, yet in her heart bloomed something greater than fear, hope, fragile as a flower pushing through hard earth, yet strong enough to reach for the sun. The dawn would come soon, and with it the footsteps of fate. But for now, the night belonged to them. The fire's glow, the healing bond between guardian and child, and the quiet certainty that love, in its purest form, had already begun to reshape both their lives. The days stretched long into summer's heart, and the land seemed to hold its breath with them. Each morning, Sarah rose with the sun, her movements once lonely and mechanical, now softened by the knowledge that she was no longer moving through the silence alone. Taza followed her like a small, steady shadow, his presence a quiet comfort she hadn't realized she had been waiting for. The child who had once refused her touch now carried trust in his dark eyes, and though words between them remained sparse, their bond grew deeper in the silence, richer than anything spoken aloud. He had begun to laugh, faint at first, more like a flutter of sound than true joy, but it warmed the air of the cabin like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sometimes it was over the simplest things, the way a rabbit darted clumsily across their path, or the strange face Sarah made when she burned her fingers on the skillet. His laughter was a fragile, healing music, filling spaces where grief had once echoed. Sarah found herself laughing too, the sound rusty, uncertain, but alive. She felt her heart expand in ways that frightened and soothed her all at once. Together they built a rhythm. He showed her how to find the roots that held water even in the driest stretches of earth, how to read the wind by the way grass bent and shifted. She, in turn, guided his hands as he learned to grind flour, to mend clothes, to carve rough little toys from scraps of wood. The work of survival became more than necessity. It became communion. The land no longer seemed a cruel warden, but a living space they shared, each teaching the other how to belong. Evenings were their most sacred time. As the fire crackled, Sarah would sit at the table, her hands busy with stitching, while Taza sprawled near the hearth, shaping small figures out of clay he dug from the stream bed. Sometimes he would bring one to her, holding it with shy pride. She kept them all, tiny animals, crude yet full of spirit, lining them along the shelf as if they were treasures. They became symbols of their quiet victories, proof that creation still thrived in a world marked so often by loss. And yet the shadow of danger lingered at the edges of their peace. Sarah knew Corrigan's kind did not forget. The $50 bounty was a fire waiting to consume them. She carried her rifle everywhere, her eyes constantly searching the horizon, her body always alert for the drum of hooves or the glint of metal in the sun. Fear was a constant presence, but not the kind that hollowed her as before. This fear gave her purpose. It sharpened her love into steel, into vow. Her strength was tested when Jedediah returned. His weathered face carried the burden of truths Sarah did not wish to hear. He greeted Taza with a quiet nod, and then, over the fire's glow, told Sarah that Cochise himself would never stop searching for his son. That there were factions among the Apache who would tear the boy from her if it gave them power. That the army, too, was watching, waiting. His voice was low, grave, every word etched with sorrow. Sarah listened, the fire's light catching in her eyes, her hands gripping the edge of the chair until her knuckles whitened. She understood the depth of the peril, but when she looked at Taza, his small body curled against the blanket, his breathing steady, her fear transformed into resolve. She told Jedediah, her voice trembling yet steady, that she would keep the boy safe, that no soldier, no bounty hunter, no rival Apache would take him from her. Jedediah studied her, his old eyes full of something like admiration, and then sorrow. He knew the truth she did not yet face, that fate was larger than either of them, and that choice alone would not shield them. He left at dawn, his mule's hooves fading into silence, and Sarah stood long at the doorway, the cool morning air pressing against her skin, knowing his words had carved themselves into her heart. Days passed, carrying with them an uneasy peace. Taza began to speak more often, not just words, but small sentences, first in his language, then haltingly in hers. One evening, while she stirred the stew, he pointed to the stars through the cabin's small window. His voice was soft, reverent, naming each cluster in Apache. He told her, in words stitched together with effort, that they were the campfires of his ancestors, watching, guiding. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she followed his gaze. The stars had once been to her only cold lights in a vast loneliness. Now they were witnesses, luminous threads binding past to present, grief to hope. The nights brought dreams, some gentle, some restless. Sarah often woke to the sound of Taza murmuring in his sleep, his brow furrowed, his small body twisted in memory's grip. Each time she knelt beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his skin, whispering words that had no language but all the warmth of a mother's love. He would settle then, the tension easing, and she would remain by his side until dawn painted the horizon. In those moments she felt the ghost of her own daughter near, not as a wound, but as a gentle presence, as if her child had guided Taza to her, a gift sent across the wilderness of sorrow. The bond between them deepened beyond fear, beyond survival. Sarah began to feel herself alive again, her steps lighter, her gaze clearer. She no longer carried her grief like a stone, pressing her into the earth. Instead, she carried it like soil from which something new could grow. Taza was that growth, fragile yet fierce, his trust in her the seed of her healing. But peace could never last forever. One evening, as the sun bled into the earth, painting the sky with crimson and gold, Sarah sensed a change in the air. The wind shifted, carrying with it a weight, a stillness that was not natural. She rose, her hand instinctively finding the Winchester, her heart pounding. Taza, seated near the hearth, lifted his head as though he too felt it. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange both knew. Through the window she saw them, shadows moving across the plain, silent, steady, encircling the cabin with the patience of ghosts. Figures emerged from the darkness, warriors whose faces were painted with solemnity, not war, their movements fluid, purposeful. Sarah's breath caught, her body taut with fear. She had expected the cavalry, the greedy hands of Corrigan. Instead, it was the Apache. She clutched the rifle, ready, heart hammering, but then she saw Taza rise. He walked to the door, his small figure bathed in moonlight, and unbarred it without fear. Sarah's lips parted to stop him, but she did not move. The boy looked back at her, eyes steady, filled with something she could not name. Then he stepped into the night, where destiny waited. And in that moment, Sarah understood. The time she had feared, the meeting that would decide everything, had arrived. The life they had woven together inside her cabin had been precious, but the world beyond was calling, and neither of them could turn away. The night breathed with tension, yet beneath it flowed something else, an ancient current of recognition, of healing waiting just beyond fear. The next breath, the next heartbeat would change everything. The night pressed heavy, thick with silence, the kind of silence that carried weight rather than emptiness. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, the Winchester clutched tight in her trembling hands, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. Outside, the shapes of Apache warriors shimmered in the pale silver light, their figures rising like spirits out of the earth. They surrounded her cabin in a solemn half-circle, their presence neither hostile nor hasty, but patient, as if they had stepped into this moment knowing it had been carved by fate itself. Taza moved first. His small frame seemed to hold a gravity far beyond his years as he stepped forward into the moonlight. His bare feet brushed against the dry earth, his chin lifted, his gaze steady. Sarah wanted to reach for him, to pull him back into the safety of the cabin, but something in his eyes, calm, resolute, held her in place. He looked once over his shoulder at her, a silent reassurance, and then he faced the tall warrior at the threshold. The man was broad-shouldered, his chest bare, his long black hair bound with leather, and in his hand he carried not a weapon, but a single eagle feather. His face was carved with dignity, lines etched by both grief and strength. For an endless moment he simply looked at the boy. Then his composure broke, his eyes flooding with something primal and uncontainable. He dropped to his knees and drew Taza into his arms. The child disappeared against his chest, and the warrior's shoulders shook with silent sobs, the kind that rip open the heart. Sarah's breath faltered as she watched, her rifle lowering slowly until it hung useless at her side. She knew without being told who this man was. The aura of him, the authority in his stillness, the deep sorrow carved into his gaze. This was Cochise, the great chief, the man whose name had haunted her nightmares, the man she had long blamed for her widowhood. And yet here he knelt, not as a leader, not as a terror of the frontier, but as a father who had found his son. Taza clung to him, his small voice breaking the silence with a single word. Father. It was the first time Sarah had heard him speak the word, and it carried such tenderness that her throat closed with tears. Cochise lifted his gaze then, his eyes finding Sarah where she stood at the door. His expression was unreadable, stern, yet softened by gratitude. He spoke in his language, his voice low, reverberating like distant thunder. Taza, still pressed close to his father's side, translated, his young voice steady. My father asks why you did not claim the bounty for his son. The words struck Sarah like a cold wind. She understood then the cruel deceit of Sergeant Corrigan, how he must have twisted truth to poison both sides. Her voice trembled, but it carried fierce clarity. I never wanted money, she said, each word a stone laid with conviction. I saved him because he was a child in danger. I was protecting him. Taza repeated her words in Apache, and Cochise listened, his gaze never leaving her face. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of judgment, until finally he stepped closer, his son still beside him. In his eyes, Sarah saw not the monster of stories, but a man carrying both grief and honor, a father whose love was as fierce as her own had been. He spoke again, softer now, and Taza's translation carried across the still night. My father says he knows this. He says a man who lies for money has a shifty heart. He says he came not to fight, but to see the woman who saved the son of her enemy. Then, with a gesture, the warriors behind him stepped forward one by one. They laid gifts at Sarah's feet, deerskins supple as velvet, baskets filled with corn and beans, a blanket woven in the colors of sunset, and finally a Spencer repeating rifle gleaming with promise. These were not tokens of debt, but of honor, of gratitude. Sarah stared, her throat tight, her heart struggling to comprehend the depth of what was unfolding before her. Cochise spoke once more, his words carrying the weight of ritual. Taza looked up at her, pride shining in his dark eyes, and said, My father says you have shown great honor. He says no Apache will ever harm you or your home. You are one of us now. You are Shima Yazi. The name lingered in the air, soft yet profound. Sarah whispered it back, hesitant, tasting the syllables as though they carried a new identity, a rebirth. What does it mean? She asked. Taza smiled then, rare and radiant, and his voice was warm with affection. It means little mother. The word struck her deeper than any wound. Little mother. It was more than a title. It was a recognition of the bond she had forged, of the love she had poured into this child who was not hers, yet wholly hers in the ways that mattered. She felt her knees weaken, tears pressing hot against her eyes, as the ache of her past grief was met with something healing and whole. The warriors stood silently, watching her with solemn respect. For the first time in years, Sarah did not feel alone, did not feel like a widow adrift in endless sorrow. She felt part of something larger, something woven from compassion and courage, something that transcended the boundaries of blood and nation. As dawn's first light crept across the horizon, painting the world in rose and gold, the warriors melted back into the wilderness as silently as they had come. Cochise lingered a moment longer, his hand resting upon his son's shoulder. He looked at Sarah with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through her, and then he gave a single nod, a gesture of profound respect, before vanishing into the waking world. Sarah remained on the threshold, the gifts at her feet, the boy by her side. The land was the same, the plains stretching endless, the wind whispering low, the sky vast and eternal. But within her, everything had changed. She was no longer only a widow defined by grief. She was Shima Yazi, Little Mother. A bridge between two worlds, a woman whose compassion had rewritten the story of survival into one of hope. And as the sun lifted higher, warm upon her face, Sarah felt something long buried rise within her, a quiet joy, tender and healing, as if the wilderness itself had laid down its weight and offered her peace. The path ahead was still unknown, filled with shadows and trials yet to come, but for the first time she was ready to meet it, not with emptiness, but with love reborn. The morning that followed carried a softness Sarah had not felt in years. The air was cool with the lingering kiss of night, yet touched by the first warmth of dawn. She stood at the doorway of her cabin, her eyes roaming over the gifts left at her feet. Blankets, food, hides, a rifle gleaming with promise. They seemed almost unreal, as though the night had been a dream spun out of grief and gratitude. But the steady rise of smoke curling into the sky, the quiet stirrings of the land, and the small figure of Taza moving beside her were proof enough that everything had changed. He stood close, his eyes brighter than she had ever seen them, no longer clouded by fear or silence. His small hand brushed against hers, deliberate, a wordless act of belonging. Sarah looked down at him, her chest tightening with an emotion too vast to name. For years her heart had been a hollow chamber, echoing only with loss. Now it pulsed with something alive, something healing, something that tethered her to the world again. The cabin, once a monument to solitude, had transformed into a sanctuary. The walls no longer held the ghosts of sorrow alone, but also the quiet laughter of shared language, the rhythm of chores done side by side, the hush of comfort whispered in the night. It was no longer a place where a widow endured. It was a home where a woman and a boy, unlikely companions, had woven a fragile but enduring thread of love. As days bled into weeks, Sarah felt the wilderness itself shift in her presence. The wind that once mourned now carried whispers of renewal. The wide plains, once a mirror of emptiness, now shimmered with possibility. Every sunrise seemed to promise more than survival. It promised connection. She found joy in the smallest acts, kneeling beside Taza as he traced patterns in the dirt, humming while he gathered berries, feeling his eyes watch her with a trust that grew deeper each day. Healing was no longer a distant dream, but something she lived with each breath. She often thought of Cochise's gaze, the way it had searched her soul and found truth there. That memory lingered like a quiet vow. She was no longer simply Sarah McGregor, the widow abandoned by fate. She was Shima Yazi, Little Mother, claimed not only by a child, but by an entire people. The name rooted itself within her, carrying both weight and comfort. It was a reminder that her compassion had not been weakness, but strength, that love was never wasted, even when born of grief. At night, when firelight painted their faces in gold and shadow, Sarah sometimes watched Taza as he drifted to sleep. His breathing was steady, his features softened by innocence, his hand often curled loosely around the carved wooden figures he made. She would sit quietly, her heart swelling with gratitude, realizing that in saving him she had unknowingly saved herself. Where she had once lived only to endure, she now lived to protect, to nurture, to hope. The seasons stretched onward. She tilled her stubborn soil with more resolve, planted seeds, not only for food, but for the future she could now imagine. She taught Taza her ways as he taught her his, and together they created a rhythm of life that belonged to neither world fully, yet somehow belonged entirely to them. Each day carved away more of her loneliness, replacing it with something that felt like family. The dangers had not vanished. Sarah knew the world beyond her cabin still held men like Corrigan, still carried the threat of hunger and war. But fear no longer consumed her. Love had rooted itself too deeply. It was a shield stronger than iron, a fire that could not be extinguished by shadows. She understood now that healing did not mean forgetting grief, but carrying it alongside new life, letting it transform into soil from which hope could grow. And as she stood once more in the threshold of her cabin, watching the horizon glow with another sunrise, Sarah smiled. The land had not changed. The vast plains still stretched unbroken, the coyotes still called at dusk, the winds still roamed wild. But she had. Within her lived not only the memory of loss, but the presence of love, renewed and enduring. She was not alone. She was not broken. She was alive, carrying the name Shima Yazi with quiet pride. Her story was not one of endings, but of beginnings. In the wilderness where she had once buried her heart, she had found a reason to live again. And though the road ahead would be uncertain, she now walked it with the strength of love, the warmth of healing, and the unwavering knowledge that compassion could change the course of fate itself. If this story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of the quiet strength hidden in love and the healing power of compassion, let your voice join ours. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your heart be heard. If you feel the warmth of Sarah's journey in your own spirit, please like this story, subscribe for more, and help us continue weaving tales that bring light, comfort, and hope. Your presence, your words, are part of this healing journey too.